He set out to photograph wildlife at dawn and vanished before his camera captured the second frame. The only thing left behind? A tripod still warm, as if something had been standing there long after he was gone. Search teams followed his trail until the trail simply stopped mid-step, like the earth took him upward. Now his footage reveals a presence the forest never meant us to see. And whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting for the next watcher who dares to look. Nathan Cole lived for mornings like this. He adjusted the strap of his camera pack and tightened the last leg of his tripod with careful hands. He was alone near the restricted sector of the wildlife reserve, a zone technically off-limits without ranger escort, but Nathan had secured a private permit through persistence and reputation. After a decade of capturing rare predatory behavior across remote landscapes, he'd earned a cautious trust with park management. His goal this time wasn't beauty, it was proof. Rumors had circulated about a creature too large to be a wolf, too fast to be a bear. Locals referred to it with nervous humor, the Ridge Walker. Every sighting was secondary information, a noise in the dark, a moving shadow at tree line, prints found where prints shouldn't exist. Nathan hated mysteries without evidence. Today, he planned to catch the unknown in focus. He crouched slightly to look through the viewfinder, his breath fogging in front of the lens. A distant clearing lay framed between two massive Douglas firs, the perfect natural runway if anything emerged from the woods. His camera's autofocus beeped softly, locking onto a stump in the center. Satisfied with the setup, he stepped back and let the silence reclaim the space around him. Nathan checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. Peak predator movement window. He rolled his shoulders to warm up against the creeping chill. The air carried a kind of cold that felt too still, almost calculated. He clicked his shutter to test the first exposure. The photo was ordinary. Blue light, quiet trees, undisturbed ground. Then, a soft crunch broke the silence. His heartbeat spiked. He swung his eyes to the tree line. Something shifted between branches, too low for a deer, too smooth for wind. He gently twisted the focus ring again. Another noise. A deep exhale from somewhere beyond. The tripod camera stood ready, pointed at the exact place the disturbance originated. Nathan leaned forward, squinting as his eyes adjusted to subtle motion. Something was there, watching. He zoomed slightly. The shape was angled, half hidden, almost still but not fully motionless. It glided once more, steps silent, posture alternating between upright and low crouch. It was behaving like a hunter, but with a strange, deliberate caution. No wild animal moved like it was rehearsing. Nathan's pulse accelerated. He adjusted exposure and snapped a burst of 3 images. Click, click, click. He kept his eye glued to the lens, but nothing remained in sight. Gone. He zoomed out, scanning every shadow the camera could frame. Mist thickened in the clearing, swallowing the view like the forest had changed its mind about being observed. Nathan stepped forward instinctively, closer to the unknown. That's when he noticed the tripod. It had shifted, slightly, as if bumped by something that circled around him without sound. He swallowed. The cold suddenly felt different, not the kind weather creates, but the kind presence brings. He forced himself to stay rational, metal on uneven ground, subtle vibration, camera settling. Logical, probably. He crouched to check the base and noticed faint indentations in the soil, 3 of them, spaced unevenly yet pressed deep. Not boots, not hooves. The spacing suggested something large, weight distributed oddly, almost like hands. Nathan carefully captured a close-up photo of those impressions. He could feel fear trying to rewrite what he saw, but he resisted. Nature didn't manipulate your mind. Humans did that themselves. Branches rustled overhead. Nathan froze. Above him, in the pine canopy, something vaulted from one trunk to another, silent, except for the leaves that trembled too long after impact. He stared upward, camera raised halfway, searching the dark lattice of branches. No form visible now, only the echo of sudden motion. Predators didn't move like that. Predators didn't leap so far without breaking branches. Predators reacted to intruders. This thing was testing him. He stepped back toward his tripod when a sudden pressure filled the air, like the valley itself inhaled. The mist around his legs spiraled inward, drawn toward the clearing where the creature had first appeared. Nathan captured another frame, empty again. The camera clicked softly. Then, a faint audio recording icon blinked. His camera had switched modes. He hadn't touched it. For a moment, Nathan considered retreat, but photographers don't travel thousands of miles to retreat from a blur. He steadied himself, repositioned behind his tripod, and waited, posture stiff, breath held. There was no warning. A shockwave of sound erupted, not roar, not growl, but a sharp snap like something enormous breaking free from a constraint. The forest responded, birds burst from trees in chaotic flight, and somewhere far off, a distant howl screamed upward into the morning. He swallowed. The cold suddenly felt different. Not the kind weather creates, but the kind presence brings. He forced himself to stay rational. Metal on uneven ground, subtle vibration, camera settling. Logical, probably. He crouched to check the base and noticed faint indentations in the soil, 3 of them, spaced unevenly yet pressed deep. Not boots, not hooves. The spacing suggested something large, weight distributed oddly, almost like hands. Nathan carefully captured a close-up photo of those impressions. He could feel fear trying to rewrite what he saw, but he resisted. Nathan's camera recorded continuously now. His hand reached instinctively to grip the tripod and recoiled. The metal was warm. Not just warm, radiating heat as though freshly handled by living flesh. His gloves insulated him, but heat pulsed through fabric, unmistakable, unnatural. Everything inside Nathan screamed to move, but he held position. He trained his camera again on the clearing, desperately scanning. The world felt predatory, like the hunter had become bait without realizing the exact moment of role reversal. He looked down at the last previewed photo. A blur, yes, but a blur too large, too upright, and too close to be misinterpreted. He raised his camera again, and the clearing was no longer empty. A solid silhouette stood at the edge of the mist, tall, unflinching, staring directly at him. He aimed the focus, but his fingers shook enough to betray him. The shape took one step forward. Nathan swallowed hard, and a rustling swept behind him at the same instant. 2 directions at once. He spun around. Nothing. He pivoted back. The silhouette had vanished. Then another movement, closer. Ground disturbed inches from his boot. He stumbled back, heart racing, and the world snapped to black. Just one breath too late. Hours later, when trackers found the site, Nathan's tripod still stood perfectly upright, undisturbed by wind or gravity. The camera still recorded, collecting only silence, and the tripod, impossibly, was warm to the touch. Before the headlines, before the search teams and theories, Nathan Cole had simply been a man trying to chase meaning the only way he knew how, through his lens. What made his disappearance so haunting wasn't only how mysterious it was, but how predictable it should never have been. People like Nathan didn't vanish. They were the ones who studied vanishings. Born in a quiet suburb outside Olympia, Washington, Nathan had never wanted a normal life. He wasn't built for small talk or big crowds. Even as a child, he preferred the company of quiet places, forests, marshes, riverbanks, anywhere the air felt honest and the noise of the world fell away. His mother once said, "He listens to animals better than he listens to people." She meant it as an observation, but Nathan turned it into a purpose.
By high school, he carried a second-hand camera everywhere. While other teens recorded parties, Nathan waited under trees for foxes to appear at dusk. His teachers called it talent. He called it proof that patience matters. He studied wildlife biology in college, but photography was always his real pulse. He believed animals told stories humans had forgotten how to hear. After graduation, he built a reputation documenting elusive species: wolves in Montana, bighorn sheep on Nevada cliffs, rare hawks in Oregon's canyons. Publications noticed. Outdoor companies came calling. Suddenly, he wasn't just photographing animals, he was tracking habits, mapping behavior, predicting movement patterns with unnerving accuracy. He understood predators. He respected boundaries. He never crossed lines without knowing which direction the danger would come from. Except this time. Friends described Nathan as calm even when storms hit. He didn't scare easily, which is why the subtle shifts in his behavior before this trip mattered. 3 months earlier, during a night expedition in northern Idaho, he had captured a recording he didn't talk about publicly. His assistant at the time, Daniel Rhodes, recalled Nathan stopping mid-trek, staring into the dark like he recognized something watching. "There's something different out here," Nathan whispered. Daniel had laughed it off until Nathan showed him the audio later. A low, rhythmic clicking sound echoed in the recording. Not insect, not machinery, almost like talons tapping wood, or something communicating in an unknown frequency. Nathan attempted to submit it to researchers, but every reply labeled the sound file corrupted.
After that night, Nathan didn't sleep well. He kept checking the tree line behind his house. He'd go still whenever he heard something running far off, as if waiting to recognize the pattern. He didn't scare easily, but he became defensive easily. Daniel never saw him rattled before that recording. Nathan's sister, Caroline, noticed other shifts. He stopped mentioning his future photography plans. He became obsessed with a specific wilderness zone, a remote, restricted reserve, where rumors of an unidentified predator had circulated among rangers for years. Not a myth told in bars, a pattern whispered in station logs. Caroline had asked him more than once, "What are you really looking for out there?" Nathan always deflected, "I want to capture something nobody has seen clearly yet." But beneath his controlled tone was tension, as if he wasn't searching for something new, but something he had already encountered. Nathan seemed to be tracking an intelligence, not an animal, something that studied him too. In the weeks leading up to the trip, he spent hours reviewing maps, analyzing topography, checking wildlife migration data. His notes had coordination marks circling the exact ravine where he would later disappear. Each circle was labeled with one word: sightings. His research binder included pages containing descriptions from anonymous rangers. Moves upright when it wants to. Claws like elk hooves but spacing wrong. Stops making sound mid-chase. Eyeshine seen from 8 to 10 feet height. Tracks vanish as if lifted. Nathan wasn't just hoping for proof, he was preparing for confrontation. He purchased a new high-speed lens, upgraded his tripod to reinforced alloy, and packed heat sensors normally used for search and rescue specialists. His planning wasn't careless, it was clinical. Still, he went alone. And that single choice remains the most debated part of his story. Why didn't he bring a partner? Why reject offers from colleagues who would have gladly joined? Nathan reportedly told Caroline on the phone, "If I'm right, it only shows itself when no one else is near." Those words became his last conversation with her. When he arrived at the reserve, rangers required him to check in daily. The first 2 check-ins were normal, brief notes about wild elk and nighttime rustling. But on the 3rd night, his message shifted into caution. Saw movement, upright, observing me. By the 4th sunset, the messages stopped.
Rangers assumed his device battery died. It had happened before. Nathan often lost track of time when framing wildlife shots and let gear run low. They didn't worry. Not until later, when someone reached his campsite and found his gear intact, tripod standing, but no sign of him. Nathan's disappearance would spark one of the largest search operations the reserve had ever conducted. But before the chaos, before reporters arrived, before the government stepped in quietly, there was a moment of eerie simplicity. His campsite told a story. There was no struggle, no blood, no dragged soil lines, no predator scat nearby, no broken branches, no ripped clothing. Just absence, so clean it looked unnatural. And the most disturbing detail of all, while everything else had cooled in the morning air, the tripod remained warm for hours. One investigator placed his palm over the metal, jerking back immediately. The heat wasn't fading like a stored temperature would. It pulsed, irregular and alive, like something had been holding it in recent minutes. Not a bear, not a human. Something that left no trace, but didn't leave the equipment alone. Nathan, the expert tracker, had become the one who left no tracks. Not because he walked away, because something took him where tracks cannot follow. Later, when authorities reviewed his last photo, they isolated a shape standing behind him, a tall, faint silhouette bending at an angle no human spine allows. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when the reserve revealed its true face, vast, untouched, and quietly hostile in a way that didn't rely on claws or teeth. Nathan had chosen this place with purpose, drawn to its layered history and the strange patterns hidden inside its boundaries. The wildlife reserve stretched across thousands of acres, a sanctuary built with the intention of protecting fragile species, yet it carried a reputation so grim that even seasoned hikers avoided the deeper corridors of its wilderness. For most people, it was simply a restricted area. For Nathan, it was a place where questions waited for someone stubborn enough to seek answers. What set this reserve apart wasn't just the thick canopy or sudden drop-offs carved by forgotten rivers. It was the silence, a silence so complete it felt manufactured. Visitors often said the stillness pressed against their ears until they could hear their own heartbeat louder than the wind. Nathan had noted the same observation in his journal weeks earlier, writing that the quiet felt heavier than sound, like it's covering something rather than replacing it. That unsettling weight was one reason he camped there. He believed silence always meant something was watching, listening, or hiding. The reserve's past wasn't clean. Over the last decade, 12 disappearances had been reported around its borders. Hikers, researchers, even experienced wildlife experts. Each case unresolved, each person last seen in areas later marked with restricted access signs. Officials blamed uneven terrain, sudden rock slides, wild animal encounters, or simple disorientation. But Nathan had read the ranger reports. Too many details didn't align. Belongings left behind in organized patterns, radio signals cut abruptly, and footprints ending as if the individuals took their last steps into thin air. On maps, those spots formed a crooked arc, leading inward like a trail marked by absence. Rangers patrolling the reserve were trained to avoid discussing these incidents publicly, yet off-record conversations painted a different story. Several of them described finding claw patterns on trees spaced at near-perfect intervals, marks too high to belong to common predators and too clean to be caused by accidents. Others claimed their patrol vehicles would abruptly lose GPS tracking for minutes at a time, even on open ground. One ranger wrote in a confidential log that he heard a rhythmic clicking echoing through the forest on 3 separate nights, clicks that followed him no matter which direction he turned. Nathan had taken these reports seriously, seeing them not as exaggerations, but as pieces of a larger, unsolved puzzle. The heart of the reserve contained an area the staff unofficially called the Silent Zone, a patch where birds refused to nest and deer never left tracks. Even insects avoided it. Temperature dropped slightly within its perimeter, though no one could explain why. Nathan had camped more than once on the edge of this zone, describing it as too quiet to be dead, too alive to be natural. He was careful, strategic, always scanning the tree line, adjusting his camera as though expecting something to step into frame at any moment. He wasn't reckless. He simply believed something extraordinary moved inside that zone, something the reserve was never designed to contain. On the morning of his disappearance, Nathan had positioned his tent not far from the one place rangers constantly warned visitors to avoid. They called it the taboo line, a narrow incline leading upward to a ridge that overlooked the silent zone. No trail markers existed there. According to old park logs, the ridge had been closed years ago after multiple incidents involving unknown environmental hazards. Nathan, drawn by this pattern, followed it intentionally. He believed the ridge offered the best vantage point for photographing whatever crossed the silent ground before dawn. His notes showed he felt closer than ever to proving something unusual inhabited the reserve. As the search teams later retraced his path, they uncovered fragments of subtle activity, twigs arranged in curved shapes, almost like markers or signs, soil disturbed in long arcs, as though something had moved swiftly and then halted with perfect control. The team's lead ranger, a veteran with 30 years of field experience, said he had never seen animal behavior that created such symmetrical patterns. Even the birds that usually scattered in noisy flocks remained absent, leaving the air unnervingly hollow. The deeper the team ventured, the more the reserve seemed to change around them. Trees thinned without explanation, light shifting in strange gradients as if filtered through an unseen curtain. The search dogs, normally steady, hesitated frequently, pausing with ears raised toward spaces where nothing moved. Rangers reported the same pressure Nathan once described, that strange sensation of being inside a silence so deliberate it felt engineered. By midday, even the wind seemed to avoid the ridge, brushing the canopy around it but never passing directly overhead. The most unsettling discovery came when a drone operator scanned the inner section of the reserve and caught sight of a second tripod, standing alone in a clearing much deeper than Nathan had ventured. Dust covered it, suggesting it hadn't been used recently, yet the setup angle of the legs indicated someone had placed it carefully, not dropped or abandoned haphazardly. The tripod didn't belong to Nathan. Records showed it wasn't issued by the reserve or any nearby research team. Its presence hinted at another photographer, someone who had vanished without leaving a trace, someone Nathan never knew about.
That realization shook the search team more than any environmental oddity. It meant the reserve didn't just swallow one person. It had been swallowing observers long before Nathan arrived. As the drone hovered for a closer look, the camera feed flickered. A wave of static rolled across the screen, bending the image as though something large had passed between the drone and the tripod. The feed recovered after several seconds, but the clearing was empty. The tripod remained untouched, perfectly still, surrounded by trees that somehow felt as though they were leaning inward. The reserve, with all its restrictions and carefully worded warnings, seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a boundary, holding something in rather than keeping people out. And the more the rangers uncovered, the more the pieces aligned with Nathan's fears, his instincts, and his final unsettling fascination. No one approached the newly discovered tripod, yet when the search team returned an hour later, it had shifted several inches to the left, its legs pressed deeper into the soil, as though something had repositioned it to get a better view. The discovery of Nathan's abandoned tripod unsettled the search team in ways they couldn't easily admit aloud. Tripods, by nature, were cold instruments, aluminum legs that matched the temperature of the morning air within minutes. Yet the moment a ranger crouched beside Nathan's setup, he jerked his hand back as though he had touched something alive. The metal radiated warmth, not faintly, but with a heat that suggested recent and extended contact. And Nathan had been missing for hours. The sun wasn't strong enough to heat equipment this deeply, not in the shaded pocket of the ridge where the tripod stood. It felt as though something had been holding onto it long after Nathan was gone.
The ranger's thermometer confirmed the impossible. The temperature readings hovered several degrees higher than ambient conditions, climbing slowly, almost pulsing. The metal wasn't cooling as it should, it was staying warm, as though it had its own source of heat. The search team exchanged looks but avoided forming the thoughts in their minds into words. Technology doesn't warm itself. Equipment doesn't behave like a living thing. Something had interacted with it, something that wasn't Nathan. When the team examined the lower leg of the tripod, they found thin strands of fur snagged against the metal. At first glance, it seemed like common wildlife residue, maybe from a curious mammal brushing past. But when the team biologist looked closer, her expression sharpened. The fur was unusually long, almost silky, but arranged in a layered pattern she couldn't match to any known species in the region. Under magnification, each strand tapered into a structure resembling hollow filaments, lightweight but incredibly strong. Wolves didn't have it, bears didn't have it, mountain cats didn't have it. Even the reserve's most exotic protected species didn't have anything close. She bagged the sample but hesitated before writing the label. What exactly do you name when you don't know what it belongs to? As they continued inspecting the area around the tripod, the team found circular patterns in the ground, subtle but unmistakably intentional. The soil had been pressed into a broad ring, the weight distribution so even it looked almost mechanical. But the imprint depth told another story. Whatever created the pattern wasn't a machine. It had moved with precision, silent control, and a deliberate rhythm. It circled Nathan's tripod not once, but several times, adjusting its rotation like it was studying or inspecting his equipment. The unsettling part wasn't just what the ring suggested, it was how close the pattern came to where Nathan had last been standing. His footprints ended at the tripod, tightly spaced, as though he had been focusing his lens carefully. The ring overlapped the edges of his prints in places, hinting that something had moved around him while he was completely unaware. The search team found no signs of a struggle, no rushed movements, no signs that Nathan tried to run. It was as if he had stood there calmly while something massive paced around him, just out of his field of vision. The camera itself told an even stranger story. Its last recorded autofocus lock showed a focal depth calibrated for something standing exactly where Nathan had stood. The lens had adjusted, refocused, and held that lock for several seconds, but captured no visible subject. It was as if the camera recognized something the human eye couldn't see, a presence, a shape, something with enough mass to attract the lens, but not enough reflectivity to appear in the frame. One of the rangers replayed the final autofocus recording over and over, noting the subtle clicks and internal shifts of the mechanism. Cameras don't lie, they respond to real stimuli. Something big had occupied Nathan's space in those final moments before his disappearance. The team's analytical technician ran the footage through a heat mapping filter, hoping to uncover traces their eyes had missed. The result made her freeze mid-breath. Behind Nathan, just beyond the frame's main focal point, was a faint silhouette of heat, not bright enough to be a human, not diffuse enough to be an animal. The shape was tall, elongated, and disturbingly symmetrical. Shoulders too broad, arms too long, torso tapering in a way no known species displayed. It was vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, like a figure stretched by something unnatural. She enlarged the thermal outline, enhancing only the temperature variations. The silhouette grew sharper, revealing angles where flesh should have curved and proportions that defied biology. Whatever stood there wasn't fully warm-blooded, but it wasn't cold either. It was something in between, something regulating heat in a way no predator on record could.
The technician minimized the image quickly, as though prolonged viewing might invite something she didn't want to acknowledge. "It's not a glitch," she whispered. "Whatever this is, it moved." As the rangers stood in the clearing, the air around them felt denser, heavier. Not dangerous, not openly hostile, just aware. Aware in a way that prickled the back of their necks. The tripod, still warm against the morning air, seemed less like abandoned equipment and more like a trace of an interaction, a moment when two beings, one human, one unknown, occupied the same space. The team leader asked for additional scans of the ground. A new pattern emerged, faint impressions, spaced evenly, suggesting something had stood beside Nathan with perfect balance. No heel marks, no toe marks, just pressure points, slight depressions arranged in a way that suggested weight distributed far differently than human anatomy allowed. The strangest discovery came when they reviewed a second camera, a trail cam mounted 50 yards away. It had captured only a few seconds of footage during the time Nathan vanished. The clip showed nothing but an empty stretch of forest. Yet, halfway through, the camera's autofocus shifted suddenly, pointing upward as though something tall had moved between it and the ridge. Again, nothing visible appeared, but the mechanical shift was unmistakable. Cameras don't get startled. Cameras don't respond to imagination. Something had been there. As the team processed the evidence, a question settled over them, quiet and unwelcome. If this presence could stand where Nathan stood, if it could move around him without sound, if it could influence the warmth of metal hours later, what else could it do? And was it still watching them the way it had watched him? Nathan's tripod remained the only physical object that hinted at a contact point between two worlds, one known, one barely understood. The warmth slowly faded throughout the afternoon, but not by physics alone. It felt more like a memory cooling, a trace reluctantly letting go. When the team reran the heat mapping scan hours later, a second silhouette appeared behind Nathan, larger than the first, and standing just inches from him. By the time the search teams expanded deeper into the reserve, the atmosphere had shifted from methodical concern to a quiet, creeping unease. They were no longer simply looking for a missing photographer. They were navigating a landscape that reacted to their presence in subtle, disquieting ways. The trees weren't just still. They felt expectant. The ground didn't simply imprint their steps. It seemed to absorb them. Every ranger sensed the change, though no one wanted to articulate the growing suspicion that the reserve was no longer behaving like a piece of untouched wilderness. It felt reactive, almost aware. The first sign came through the audio mics the team had distributed throughout the ridge and the silent zone's perimeter. Shortly after sunset, one device picked up a low, resonant growl. Not the throatier, familiar rumble of large mammals, but something with layers, a sound that seemed to ripple, each vibration carrying an echo beneath it. Then, after several seconds of silence, the second sound came, a rapid clicking, like two stones tapping together, but too patterned, too deliberate. It wasn't wind, wasn't insects, wasn't mechanical. It was something with intention. The growls and clicks repeated twice before fading into a silence heavier than before. When the audio technician played the recording for the team, the room fell into a hushed stillness. The sounds didn't match any cataloged predator. They didn't align with any known vocalization structures in the region. And more unsettling than that, the rhythm of the clicking was almost communicative, like a signal exchanged between creatures that didn't need words. The second sign came from the movement sensors. Normally, wildlife triggered the devices with inconsistent pacing, slow, fast, pauses, scuffs, but the movement captured that night moved too quickly between two distant sensors. In seconds, something had crossed ground that would take a human several minutes to cover. Yet the stride pattern showed abrupt stops, full halts from rapid motion with no transition. No creature moved like that. Even apex predators slowed naturally as they changed direction. This one simply ceased motion, then resumed at the same speed, as if gliding instead of stepping. Rangers listening to the sensor data whispered among themselves about old reserve legends, the stories veterans told only after years on the job. One name resurfaced with uncomfortable frequency: the Ridge Watcher. Some said it was nothing more than folklore created to scare new recruits away from dangerous terrain. Others claimed it was based on shadows seen at the edge of firelight, tall figures standing too still in the tree line. Most rangers dismissed it publicly, but privately, many had recorded odd incidents they never dared submit to official logs. One recalled hearing breathing behind him on a silent patrol, only to turn and find nothing but open air. Another noticed claw marks appearing overnight on trees along paths where no animal tracks existed. These weren't scars torn through bark, they were long, deep etchings, as if something dragged weight across vertical surfaces effortlessly. The marks the team discovered near Nathan's last location matched that same pattern. High, evenly spaced, cut with precision. Something had left them intentionally. While cataloging these fresh claw marks, the team noticed wildlife shifting in an unusual rhythm. Herds of small mammals traveled in coordinated clusters away from a single direction. Birds abandoned nesting areas abruptly, leaving half-built structures behind. Not one species ventured near the ridge's deeper section. Everything fled from the same unseen point, the location where Nathan had vanished.
Later that night, a ranger monitoring a long-range camera feed noticed a sudden burst of static before the image stabilized. At the far edge of the screen, animals sprinted, every one running directly away from the ridge. Not startled by the search teams, not dispersed by noise, but fleeing from an unseen source. Their eyes reflected pale streaks of panicked light as they passed under the moonless sky. The search team grew more cautious, aware that whatever had frightened the wildlife had enough presence to alter an entire ecosystem's behavior in minutes. Yet, despite the tension, the team refused to retreat. They needed answers. Something had taken Nathan, or at the very least, something had been near him when he disappeared. Every new clue deepened that unsettling truth. As midnight approached, a fresh audio alert buzzed through the speakers. One of the forest microphones had captured a deep, resonant sound, almost like exhaling but layered with a subtle tremor. The breathing wasn't from a creature merely passing by. It lingered, slow and rhythmic, as though the entity stood in place, inhaling the night air deliberately. Then came another clicking sequence, faster this time, almost agitated. The sound shifted locations across the mics, moving around with purposeful direction. The audio interpretation software mapped the clicks across the forest grid, forming a pattern that looked strangely circular. The predator, whatever it was, seemed to be moving in the same kind of calculated rotation found in the disturbance around Nathan's tripod, controlled, measured, watching. By the time the team stepped out to investigate, the forest had entered an eerie stillness. The wind had dropped completely. Tree branches hung without the slightest tremble. A ranger raised her flashlight towards the dense undergrowth. The beam didn't catch movement, but something made the leaves tremble, not from contact, but from pressure, as if something had passed near enough to disturb the air around them. They hadn't seen the creature yet. They hadn't glimpsed eyes, outline, or shadow, but they could hear it, soft, heavy breathing that didn't belong to any animal cataloged in the reserve. The predator didn't roar or stomp. It communicated through quiet signals, coded clicks, and breath that felt too close, even when nothing visible approached. It moved with intelligence, tracking the team the way an observer studies a behavior rather than a hunter stalking prey. The rangers stepped back as faint tremors rumbled beneath the soil, barely perceptible but present. The ground reacted as though something large had shifted its weight nearby. In the otherwise still forest, the tremors felt like a warning, a reminder that the team wasn't walking through an ordinary habitat. They were in someone's territory, someone who had taken Nathan. The final evidence arrived just before dawn, when the night cameras caught a brief flash of reflected light. Only one frame captured it, two glowing eyes suspended in the darkness. Not animal bright, not reflective like a cat or wolf, but luminous, a controlled glow, almost steady, like the creature produced light from within. The eyes were staring directly into the lens. The camera's next frame showed nothing but empty clearing, yet the glow remained, lingering in the air for several seconds after the figure vanished.
The canyon trail had always been considered one of the least forgiving parts of the reserve. Even seasoned hikers described its terrain as deceptive, gentle at first glance but riddled with sudden dips, uneven ledges, and strange mineral formations that fractured sound in odd ways. It was here, on this narrow spine of earth, that Nathan's trail abruptly changed from a predictable set of footprints into the kind of mystery that reopened every question the team had been afraid to ask. At dawn, when the search team reached the canyon floor, the first signs of Nathan's movement were normal enough. His footprints were crisp and steady, spaced with the confidence of someone who knew how to navigate rough ground. The impressions showed no hesitation, no signs of stress or urgency. He had been walking with purpose, camera bag bouncing lightly, weight evenly distributed. But 50 meters farther, the trail changed in a way no one on the team could logically explain. Nathan's footprints ended mid-stride. The last impression cut sharply into the soil as though he had lifted his foot for the next step and then simply stopped existing. There were no scuff marks ahead, no disturbed pebbles, no compressed plants, no indication he'd turned, slipped, or leapt. It was as if the earth had absorbed him mid-movement, leaving only one perfectly formed footprint and a long pause in the world's breath. The rangers stared at the final print in silence, each waiting for someone else to explain what logic couldn't defend. One ranger crouched and examined the soil. No drag marks, no slide patterns, no hint of a fall. The footprint was definitive, not the beginning of a stumble. It was a movement frozen in time, as though a step had been paused by an unseen force, leaving the next motion incomplete. A ranger whispered that it looked like he had been lifted, not pulled, not grabbed, just removed from the path. The idea was dismissed instantly, not because it sounded unreasonable, but because it sounded too close to the truth everyone feared. The only clue near the trail's edge was a cluster of rope fibers snagged on a jagged rock. They were cleanly severed, sliced with unnatural precision, no fraying, no tearing, as if a perfect blade had run across them. But there were no blades in the canyon, nothing sharp enough to produce that kind of cut. Nathan carried rope for climbing, not fragile but reinforced. These fibers were thick, durable, designed to resist abrasion and strain. Yet the ends were smooth, almost polished. A ranger muttered that no natural break created a cut that perfect. As they followed the canyon wall upward, they found something stranger. Embedded in the vertical rock face were deep, elongated impressions, not scratches, not scrapes, but deliberate indentations, evenly spaced like some large being had dug into the stone to climb. The spacing wasn't human, the reach was too wide, the depth too clean. Whatever made those marks did so with the ease of a creature accustomed to elevating itself with impossible momentum. The impressions extended high above the team's reach, fading only where the rock face curved out of sight. The rangers documented the marks but avoided looking at each other, aware that these prints were not the panicked flailing of an animal, they were precise, intentional. Something had ascended the rock face using a method no known predator employed. No scrambling, no loose debris, not even a chipped edge. Just perfect, deep-set grips that looked more like controlled anchors than claw marks. While the rangers continued their examination, the ground beneath them produced a subtle tremor. It was the second time in 24 hours the soil had vibrated with that low, humming pulse. Too small to be an earthquake, too rhythmic to be random. A technician checked her equipment and confirmed that the vibration originated from a localized source beneath the canyon, not across the region. It suggested something moving underground, something with deliberate, directional motion. The tremor lasted only seconds, but it activated another microphone hidden among the canyon rocks. The audio captured a faint clicking sound, identical to the patterns heard earlier, sharp, controlled, echoing off stone walls in a way that made the canyon feel narrower, as if the sound was traveling through a confined passage beneath their feet. The clicks were followed by a low, drawn-out hum, resonant enough to make the air feel thicker. Something was communicating, shifting, or acknowledging their presence. None of the rangers said this aloud, but the message felt clear. They were not alone in the canyon. The team proceeded upward, toward a narrow outcrop Nathan had likely intended to use for his next shot. From that vantage point, the view overlooked the reserve's taboo region, dense trees stretching into shadows that never fully lifted even in daylight. Nathan had written about this vantage point in his journal, calling it the place where horizon meets hesitation. He believed something moved there, just beyond where the eye naturally lingered. At the top of the outcrop, the team discovered the faint imprint of one of Nathan's equipment bags, as though he had set it down or braced it before adjusting his camera. But the bag was gone, leaving only a mild depression in the soil, the kind that doesn't last long unless something heavy had rested there for a while. The shape suggested he had paused, aimed his camera toward the deeper forest, and prepared for a shot. Then the trail simply stopped. A ranger adjusted the angle of her flashlight and noticed something in the shadows near the ridge edge, a thin, angular shape almost blending into the terrain. It was a pattern etched into the ground, not natural, not random. The shape curved inward like a distorted arc, as if something immensely tall had braced its weight there. The indentation wasn't deep, but unmistakably intentional, like a footprint from something that didn't walk as humans do. It didn't show heels, didn't show toes. It was more like the trace of a limb shaped for climbing, gripping, or perching. Farther up the slope, the final clue waited. Nathan's last photo, stored automatically in his camera's internal memory, had been transmitted through the reserve's network during a brief window of connection. The image was blurry, taken mid-movement, but distinct enough to reveal a shape behind him. An arm-like form extended across the blurred background, long, narrow, bent at an unnatural angle. Human, but stretched, like proportions rewritten. The outline suggested something that moved vertically with ease, climbing where humans could never reach. When the team enhanced the final photo's shadows, another shape appeared, hovering just above the ridgeline. Not quite a figure, not quite an absence, but a distortion bending the light around it, watching. Long after Nathan vanished, long after the path went cold and the ridge swallowed the last trace of his footprints, his camera kept doing the one thing he'd trained it to do: observe. It sat on the tripod, abandoned but loyal, capturing hours of footage as the wilderness breathed around it. When the search team eventually recovered the memory card, they expected static, environmental noise, maybe the sway of branches in the breeze. What they found instead altered the tone of the investigation entirely, because the camera recorded long after Nathan disappeared, and something had stayed to study it. The footage began normally, familiar and motionless. The frame showed the quiet ridge, the layered shadows between the trees, the thin line where dawn faded into deeper forest. Nathan had vanished minutes before the recording started. At first, everything looked still, too still. No birds crossed, no wind brushed the leaves. The forest acted like it was holding its breath. Then, faintly, a soft rustling came from the right side of the frame, so delicate that it sounded like someone brushing fingertips across dry grass. The camera didn't shift, it kept recording, oblivious to the tension quietly tightening around it. A few minutes later, the audio captured weight. Not footsteps, not the cracking of branches, just weight. Something shifted the air pressure around the tripod, like a presence leaning in and out, testing the space. The microphone picked up a steady, controlled exhale, calm but close, too close. The breathing wasn't human. It carried an uneven cadence, like someone trying to imitate human rhythm but failing, placing breaths in the wrong places, mimicking rather than living. The silhouette didn't appear immediately. For nearly 10 minutes, the camera filmed nothing but the subtle trembling of nearby plants reacting to something moving around them without making contact. Leaves shook, but no legs passed through them. Shadows bent, but no figure stepped into the frame. The thing wasn't hiding, it simply wasn't reflecting light in a recognizable form. Whatever circled the tripod seemed to choose when it wanted to be seen. Then the lens adjusted. The autofocus clicked sharply, once, twice, trying to lock onto something rising into view. The silhouette hovered at the very edge of the frame, a tall blur that disrupted the light but refused to resolve into a distinct shape. Its movements were careful, almost curious, as if it were learning about the device rather than avoiding it. It leaned in, paused, and swayed slightly from side to side, like it was studying the tripod the same way Nathan once studied wildlife, patient, observant, withholding. Minutes passed. The tripod vibrated gently as though something brushed against one of the metal legs. The microphone picked up another exhale, this time with a faint fluttering click woven inside the breath. A ranger later described it as the sound someone makes when testing their voice for the first time, exploring how much space their sound occupied. Others said it felt like the creature was talking to the camera or testing how sound traveled through metal. Then came the moment that froze the entire search team when they reviewed the footage. A faint, distant cry echoed through the canyon. Not a scream, not a call for help, just Nathan's voice carried through the layers of forest in a tone of confusion, like he'd seen something shifting but didn't yet recognize the danger. His voice sharpened slightly, calling out again, strained but not panicked. The audio wavered, as though the sound had traveled from a place that bent distance unpredictably. The breathing around the camera changed instantly. The steady rhythm grew heavier, closer, pressing against the microphone with intent. Whatever circled the tripod reacted to Nathan's voice, not with aggression, but with interest. The breathing became almost thoughtful, like it understood the sound and was analyzing it. Another silhouette passed behind the frame, this one taller, casting an elongated distortion over the far tree line. The camera reacted by shifting focus again, its internal motor struggling to decide which presence to follow. For several seconds the footage blurred, then cleared, sharpening on nothing but empty air. Except the air didn't look quite empty. Lines bent softly around a shape that still refused to appear fully. Hours passed on the recording. Daylight dimmed, shadows stretched, and still the creature remained near the tripod, occasionally pacing in slow, even circles. Its movements carried the same precision seen in the disturbed soil around Nathan's earlier setup, a pattern of rotation, observation, patience. More machine-like than animal, more calculated than instinctual. As night settled, the camera lens fogged slightly from the shift in temperature. That was when something unmistakable happened. The tripod jolted, just once, as though touched directly. Not pushed, not knocked, but touched. The audio spiked with the faint scrape of dry skin or textured surface sliding across metal. A low clicking followed, softer than before, almost contemplative. Rangers described it as the kind of sound someone might make when tapping their fingers while thinking. Then, in the reflection of the camera lens, something finally revealed itself. The shape leaned in, close enough for its outline to appear as a faint, distorted reflection. The face shape had no eyes, not in the human sense. Instead, there were smooth, concave hollows where eyes should have been, curving inward like they were built for sensing rather than seeing. The rest of the face was elongated, featureless except for a narrow ridge running down the center, splitting the shape like a seam. The reflection lasted less than a second, but it was enough. The creature had studied the camera, and now it wanted the camera to recognize it. The breathing intensified, the microphone trembling under the sound. Not angry, not hostile, just deliberate. A presence claiming the moment, a presence aware of being observed and choosing not to hide anymore. The silhouette backed away slowly, the air distorting around it like heat rising from stone. The clicking resumed, this time in a clearer sequence, as if signaling to something unseen behind the frame.
The forest responded with an echoing hum deep beneath the canyon floor, the same tremor the team had felt earlier. A communication, a response, a call and answer. And then, after nearly 5 hours of silent interaction, the silhouette dipped out of frame and vanished so completely that the forest seemed to exhale again. The tripod stopped trembling, the breathing faded, the audio returned to natural wilderness sounds. But the camera kept recording, faithfully documenting the empty forest where something had stood moments earlier.
By the time the investigators reached the final stretch of evidence, one realization began circling through every conversation, every late-night meeting, every fragment of footage they replayed until their eyes blurred. Nathan hadn't been chosen at random. He had been selected. Something in the reserve moved with intention, not instinct, and its pattern was unmistakable once the team connected the dots. Nathan had walked into the path of something that didn't hunt for food, territory, or survival. It hunted attention. It watched watchers. The state archives provided the first break. Hidden inside a neglected storage room, behind stacks of mislabeled cardboard boxes, the team found a folder containing records from years before the reserve was established. Most of the documents were surveys and wildlife studies, but tucked between them was a faded envelope labeled only with a ranger's initials. Inside were photocopies of missing persons notices. The common detail struck immediately. Nearly all the missing individuals were photographers. Some were amateur hobbyists, some were professionals, others researchers conducting wildlife documentation. But every last one had disappeared near vantage points, lookout towers, or ridgelines, places where cameras would naturally be set up. In several cases, tripods were found abandoned, tilted faintly as if moved. In others, equipment bags remained neatly arranged. But every individual had vanished in silence, with no sign of struggle, no record of their final steps. The pattern mirrored Nathan's fate with eerie precision. The investigators pieced the timeline together. Over the last 15 years, at least 27 photographers had gone missing across various state parks in the region. Complaint logs showed that many families had reported them as lost in the wilderness, but several families insisted the victims had been experienced outdoorsmen, comfortable with terrain far rougher than the protected reserves. No official report linked the cases, but the similarities were impossible to ignore once aligned together. Every disappearance occurred near a place where the environment provided a vantage point. Every victim had been tracking wildlife sightings, and every final known observation placed them in areas marked by unnatural silence. This was not coincidence. It was behavior. When the investigators asked older rangers about the pattern, the same name resurfaced again and again, spoken quietly, cautiously, like it was a fragment of taboo knowledge. "It collects eyes," one ranger said under his breath. At first, the phrasing made no sense, but as they continued interviewing those who had patrolled the region for decades, a chilling theory emerged. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to seek out people who sought it. It didn't attack randomly, it gravitated toward observers, those who noticed the changes in the forest, those who carried cameras ready to document what shouldn't exist, those who lingered too long on ridges where the air bent strangely. One ranger described an encounter years earlier. He had been monitoring an overlook point at dusk when he felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, as if the forest had stopped listening to itself and turned all attention toward him. No creature appeared, but something observed him so profoundly that he lowered his binoculars without knowing why. He packed his gear and left without telling anyone, convinced that if he stayed another minute, something would step into his periphery and claim him. "It doesn't like being watched," he whispered, "but it doesn't ignore the watchers either." The theory became darker the deeper they dug. The entity wasn't only avoiding observation, it was learning from it. The footage from Nathan's camera, the symmetrical patterns in the soil, the controlled pacing around tripods, the mimic-like breathing, it all pointed to an intelligence gathering information. The creature approached equipment not as prey, but as objects of curiosity.
It studied metal legs, lenses, microphones, autofocus shifts, as if learning how humans captured images, as if preparing for something. The authorities, quietly aware of the unsolved disappearances, had long suspected something unusual in the area. Instead of addressing it publicly, they shut down large portions of the reserve under vague excuses: unstable terrain, seasonal hazards, wildlife protection. But none of those warnings explained the abrupt, permanent closures, or why the most scenic, ideal photography spots had been sealed off. A leaked memo obtained from a ranger who opted for early retirement stated a chilling directive: protect the reserve's integrity by restricting zones exhibiting unpredictable environmental behavior. That phrase, environmental behavior, showed up repeatedly in internal notes. It was their sanitized way of saying something was moving where nothing should move. When the investigators mapped the missing person cases onto a physical layout of the region, a pattern emerged instantly. Every disappearance formed a curved perimeter around the silent zone at the center of the reserve. The entity didn't roam randomly. It stayed near its domain and intercepted observers encroaching too close. It wasn't defending itself, not exactly. It was collecting something. People who tried to capture its presence with a lens or a pair of eyes. It seemed attracted to the act of being watched, the intent behind the observation, as if something about attention called it forth, which made Nathan the perfect target. His notes were filled with hypotheses, sketches, and half-written observations. He'd been tracking patterns long before he arrived at the reserve, convinced something moved behind the threshold of normal wildlife behavior. He was curious, persistent, unafraid of silence, and his camera was always ready. To something that hunted observers, Nathan was irresistible. Late one evening, while reviewing all recovered audio from the ridge, the team discovered a final chilling clue. One microphone near the ranger station picked up faint static just before dawn. The recording lasted only 10 seconds, barely audible under layers of interference. But when enhanced, it revealed something unmistakable. Soft breathing, measured and low, the same pattern captured near Nathan's tripod, and embedded under the breath a sequence of slow, deliberate clicks. The sound didn't come from the ridge. It came from inside the reserve's boundary, near the ranger station itself. The next morning, when the investigators returned, they found something waiting that froze them in place. Another tripod, brand new, unclaimed, its legs pressed neatly into the soil, positioned carefully as if set up by someone who understood exactly how photographers worked. The metal was warm, not freshly warm, recently held, and beside it, faintly pressed into the ground, were impressions arranged in a familiar pattern, circular, patient, observant. As investigators examined the tripod, the forest behind them exhaled, a soft, deliberate breath, and the clicking began again, this time impossibly close.